Hello and welcome to part 5 of our ARK Survival Evolved map development series. In this episode we're going to be forming our first island, going through and changing all the elevation. In addition, we're going to talk about some static meshes and how to implement them into the game. And finally, we're going to talk about some issues with the ARK dev kit. With that in mind, the first thing that we're going to talk about is forming our first island. As you can see from our entire landscape, we're going to be working on this bottom island in the bottom left-hand corner here. This is a relatively small island, but it is the first island we're going to do, and we're going to show just how big this map can be when we work on it. In previous episodes, we've talked a little bit about some of the landscape tools, and I will go over them again for redundancy's sake. Once this loads, and sometimes it does take a while, as at this point of the map creation cycle you should have a fairly large file size. Now that it's loaded, we can take a look at some of the tools that we'll be using to sculpt our first island. We did a rough outline before, and then we implemented a water system. Above the water we see the water normally, below the water we get some refraction, and we have swimming physics. Now we're going to go fine-tune the islands and make it so the player can have a starting location as well as a more challenging area as they go up the beaches into the more difficult parts of the island. This is going to involve some minor changing to the overall shape of the island, but the general shape should be pretty close. So the three main tools that we're going to use are Sculpt, Smooth, and Flatten. I've done a little bit here to show you what our end goal for the beaches should be. As we get close to the water, we should have a near horizontal movement up out of the water. This is essential in ARK, and especially on these maps, because you really don't understand how big they are until you get in and you hit play. This island that we're starting with is very large, so we need to make sure that we understand that when we're setting up some of the ramps and progression through this island. So with that in mind, I'm going to go start from a new area just so we can be on the same playing field. And I'm going to start with the Sculpt tool out. In this one, I can click to raise, or I can shift click to lower. And depending on my tool strength over here in the bottom left, we can dictate how much of that goes, or how much of that goes up. The closer you are to a full tool strength, the stronger it'll be. Now I don't really want that, so I'm going to undo that. And for these smaller touches, it really helps to have a tool strength below 0.1 or right around there. So I'm going to lower here to the point where I can see the water coming in. Because this is my beach area, I want to have something that I can use to determine what's just above the water line. Once I have something that's just above the water line, like here, I can use the Flatten tool to flatten things out. So I go to the middle area that's just above the water line, click Flatten, and lo and behold, we can do this at 1 strength for this Flatten tool. Lo and behold, I have this area that's just above the water line. It may take a couple of attempts to get this just right, but this is pretty close, and I'm reasonably happy with it. We can expand the coastline if we want to. I don't really particularly want to. What I want to do here is actually eat away at some of the shoreline, because I want this to be the starting area for the player on this island. This should be a relatively easy area, and we're going to paint it sand, so it should be relatively flat. Once we have an area that looks rather bizarre, like it's been cut out of the hill, then we'll go up here to our tools, and we're going to select the smooth, and we're going to put this strength much lower. Once we do that, we can start to even the area out between the high part and the low part of this beach. We may even go back to the Flatten tool and extend and have like a second layer on our beach. The Smooth tool averages the area in the inner circle and applies that over the outer circle. So it averages the height difference between the top part of this circle and the bottom part of the circle, and when I click down, it applies that average over the entire area of the outer circle. So sometimes you just need light touches, and other times you'll need stronger touches. So if we're going to connect these two beaches, what we need to do is actually flatten them out. And we're going to bring this beach over to this size. Once we flattened it out, we're going to pull down into the water. We're going to start at the shoreline and click and pull down into the water. And what this does is it gives you a nice entrance place into the water where the player can still go into the water but isn't jumping off a cliff to the point where they can't get back up out of the water. We'll do this for the entirety of the shoreline that is going to be this beach. You'll notice that when we do this, the water line actually pushes into the island, but it's not much, so we don't really care too much. We mostly care about having a playable surface for the player, rather than having the exact right shape of our island. And we'll see that the opposite side is true for the beach. When I'm pulling up, it actually extends our beach out a little bit. We may still end up needing to flatten out and pull our beach back, but that's okay. It's a really easy fix. It's worth noting that not everywhere do you want there to be a smooth ramp up for the player. Yes, the player can run up this area here to a higher, more difficult part of the map, but it's perfectly okay to have a beach section where they can't get up this wall. Not everything has to be easily dictated for the player. Once we're happy with the shape of our island, we can go to Paint. In Paint, we can select the Beach Sands 02. And here, with appropriate tool strength, usually around 0.3, we can start to paint over some of the grass that's on this island from the get-go. And we can see the beach that we're painting start to take shape. In a later episode, we'll add the foliage to this beach, but for now, we really just want to get the landscape to be in a playable state for the player, such that we're happy with it and we can duplicate this scene into another map. When we duplicate it into another map, this will allow us to load things more efficiently, so our map doesn't take too long to load, as can be an issue with many maps. Over here where I have this Pseudo Cliff, where the player is on the beach but won't be able to get directly up to the more difficult area, I'm going to paint a little bit of a cliff texture on the side. What this will do is indicate to the player that they can't actually walk up here, and we'll test this once we hit play. And we just want to show to the player that this is an area that they shouldn't be able to navigate over, so they don't ever struggle and feel like they're missing something. Again, when we get to a spot where we feel like there's a bit of a mesh between two different materials, we can lower our strength and do a hybrid. That's what painting with lower tool strength does. So here we have some sand, some grass up here, and some rock over here. And it all comes together in one area that has a little bit of each. Now that we've painted this section, we're going to go ahead and hit play and see what happens. If your computer freezes here, don't be afraid. It can take a while to load. Now that we're down on the beach, we can see sort of the scale of the size of what we've been working on. It felt small in the editor, but here to the player, it's almost 2 to 3 times the size of the player high. And we can see that these textures appear at high res even at the smallest setting. Again, here's the area where we're dealing with sand meeting this rock, which we can't quite walk up yet, but also meeting this grass, which is the higher, more difficult area. I think that looks pretty nice. As we go further along the beach, we can see some of our efforts with the smoothing tool. As we get closer up here, there's this more sustainable ramp that we can run up to the higher, more difficult areas of the level. And we can easily get back down to get close to the water. As we get close to the water, we can notice that there's this nice gentle slope into the water. We see our levels aren't quite perfect yet. We'll have to go back and touch them up just a little bit. But this gentle slope of progressing down into the water and up out of the water is very important for starter areas, as they sometimes need to use the water to escape from some of the carnivores that will chase them in the early game. Additionally, there may be some places on the water, I won't leave this like this, but this can be a decent illustration, where we want to dictate to the player that they can't actually climb out of the water here. So again, we're going to use this gentle smoothing technique as we get close to the line, where we just have a little bit of that top material peeking through. And this will say, as you get closer and closer to this side of this circle, you're more able to climb up this cliff. But as you're on this side, you're not able to climb up at all. And we'll do a similar thing over here. This won't be a final part of the map, but this will allow the player to understand some vertical parts. So when we get to an area like this, where we're intending for there to be a large drop-off, we can paint without really having an issue and just let the player know, hey, you're not supposed to climb up here. Let's talk about static meshes. In the background here, you can see a volcano that I've put together. This is made up of 2 mountain meshes, which we can find in our content browser down here in the left. Before I get to that, I want to talk about finding things in the content browser. Sometimes there are folders that are completely empty. That's totally normal. Sometimes there are just empty folders. However, sometimes there are missing things from the folders. If you believe that there's something that you're missing, all you need to do is go up here to File, hit Open Level, and then navigate to the map where you know that object exists. So similar to the episode where we wanted to find the water texture, we went to the island because we knew the water texture existed on the island. So in mountains, we can see that there's 3 different folders. The first one contains the materials of the various mountains. The third one contains the textures of the mountains and some of the texture mapping. This is the detail map as well as some of the color of the textures. And the second one contains all of the meshes. When you drag a static mesh into the game, it automatically pulls the material and the detail mapping onto the object that you're dragging into the game. If this takes a while and lags out your computer, don't be alarmed. But you can see that I've dragged this mountain into the game If I shift up here to place off of landscape, I can actually move it and scale it. So say I want this mountain to be near my other mountains, and I want to increase it in size. Make it taller. Move it down into the water. It's fairly easy to combine these meshes to create more elaborate things that you haven't seen in other maps. This is why in a large map, you'll often see that a map is created with 5 or 6 textures that are just created, scaled to a different size, or even rotated such that it appears different to the player each time. This is most frequently done with rocks in ARK, and we'll get to that when we start placing rocks and other foliage. And we'll get to that when we start placing rocks, foliage, and other destructibles. In the case of this mountain, we can sort of combine it, move it in and out, until we find something that looks like it is natural to the player. Sometimes we'll come across a situation on an island where we want there to be what is traditionally a destructible object, but instead we want to make it static and non-destructible. The area where you dictate whether or not something is destructible is on this Details Collision tab. Right now it says no collision. If we want it to be a destructible object, we would simply select Destructible, and that allows the player to destroy the object with the correct tool. If we want it to be something that the player cannot get past or fall through, or dig underneath, or swim underneath, or anything like that, we can select Block All. And that way, when I make this object a large rock, or something that's going to stand out on the island, the player finds out that when they run up to this rock, they won't be able to harvest it. We can see that we still run into this rock. I can't gather it, I can't punch it. If I had a pickaxe, I wouldn't be able to mine it. It's just a static mesh that the player cannot go through, it can't build on top of, and it's just a part of the island. Now there are several times on the island where you want this to be the case, most namely when you're creating caves, as you'll have to create the cave entrance and floor yourself out of meshes like rocks. With that in mind, off screen, I'm going to finish developing this entire island. From this beachy section all the way up to the more difficult and challenging parts at the top. And additionally, I will create another starting area on the other side with perhaps a slightly more difficult difficulty. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, and hopefully we'll see you next week.